From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Friday, October 25th. We know everyone is paying attention to the presidential election, but we're going to talk about the people lower down on your ballot. Maybe you've never heard of them. Probably you've never heard of them. But these contests are important because when it comes to how much money your kid's school gets, or the future of reproductive health care in the state, or how much of your state taxpayer dollars go to roads, well, it's not the people in the Oval Office who are going to be making those decisions. Today, we'll dive into the races that could determine the balance of power in the Oregon State Legislature. Welcome to the podcast. I'm political reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Dirk, we know Democrats are likely going to hold the majority in both chambers this year like they have for many years. So why should our listeners keep listening to this podcast?
I mean, first and foremost, for the amazing banter, but secondly, because even though Democrats do seem sure to retain the majorities they hold, the size of those majorities actually really matters. Right now, Democrats in both the House and Senate would need to win just one additional seat to claim 3/5 supermajorities in each chamber. With that kind of margin, Democrats could pass new taxes without needing any Republican buy-in. You know, that is dramatic at any point, but we are going into a year where the budget picture could look rocky, where school and road budgets are expected to be a major focus of this 2025 session. If Democrats achieve supermajorities, they will have leeway to address those situations without needing to craft compromise. Obviously very important.
Okay, so it would make life a lot easier for Democrats who probably want to raise taxes if they don't need Republican buy-in. First question. What do Republicans have to say about that? Second, and probably better question is it good for democracy when Democrats can enact legislation without any Republican buy-in?
So Republicans have been sending out plenty of warning flags for months about this as they look to sort of snap their donors to attention and get them really involved. A fundraising memo that House Republicans circulated over the summer said, and I'm quoting, "Should both chambers fall into Democrat-controlled supermajorities, the business climate in Oregon would become catastrophic." They are making the pitch to their business donors that they really need to get on the stick and start giving money. They are also very, very concerned about giving up additional seats. The answer to your second question is, I think, unquestionably no, it's not good for democracy. Having one party with this kind of total control has been a recipe for grievances and really greater division in Salem and beyond, because Republicans and their supporters tend to feel pretty steamrolled and abused by a majority that can do whatever it wants. And obviously that would go both ways if Democrats were in the superminority. I think back to the last time Democrats claimed fresh supermajorities in the House and Senate. That was 2018, the midterm after Donald Trump was elected president. You know, right after that election, the House Republican leader Carl Wilson compared his party to legislative speed bumps. And with Democrats in supermajorities, we saw the legislative process really gets stopped up in more and more dramatic ways. Republicans began to ratchet up delay tactics. They started what has become a commonplace strategy of walking away from the Capitol to block Democrats' bills. I don't think anyone would argue this is good for the process.
Right. Okay. Well, one thing Republicans have in their corner lately is Phil Knight and his billions of dollars and former U.S. Representative Greg Walden's connections. How is that playing out this election cycle?
So what's been really interesting to watch this year is Republican Party committees, the committees that typically drive, legislative elections, have been struggling to raise money like they normally do. And that would be a huge problem for the party because Democrats are doing just fine. But there's Greg Walden and there's Phil Knight. As we've discussed on the podcast, I think Walden, the former longtime Republican congressman, began a committee several years ago dedicated to electing Republicans to the legislature. That is its only mission. He's raised almost $6 million this election cycle to do that, and $4 million of that is from Knight. So that war chest seems like a saving grace in some ways for Republicans. It's definitely got Democrats and their backers wondering and watching, thinking, where is Walden going to spend? Where's this money going? He's sitting on millions and millions of dollars. What's going to happen? The one question, though, I have heard about Walden's committee, and actually this is from members of both parties, is whether or not it waited too long to really start spending this cycle. We've seen some huge donations in recent days, but many of those were around the time voters had ballots in their hand or were about to have ballots in their hand. I mean, typically what would be considered pretty late for candidates to really be getting ads up and running and communications going. So there is a question about whether this Bring Balance to Salem PAC jumped too late, perhaps.
Do you have any sense of why they waited so long?
You know, as I often point out on this podcast, Greg Walden will not talk to me about this, and so I don't. Unfortunately, I don't.
Before we get into some of the specific races that you're watching this year, let's just take a step back and talk about the big issues that each side is hitting. What's the messaging you're hearing from Democrats, and how does that differ from what Republicans are saying?
Yeah, let's start by acknowledging Oregon's a big state. There are local dynamics in probably all of these races that make them unique. Let's just lay that out. But broadly, it is also very clear that the two parties have hit on themes that they want to hammer home to voters. And they are largely sticking to those. And these themes will be familiar to people because they are essentially what voters heard in 2022. Democrats are really focusing their argument on protecting the right to abortion. They're hammering Republican candidates for being anti-choice. And they're pledging to keep Oregon a place where people can easily obtain an abortion. Republicans have been talking mostly about crime and disorder, things like open drug use, murders, whatever. They are hoping voters are finally so fed up with what they are seeing around them that they will buck the recent trend and choose new leadership. And then both parties, it won't surprise you to hear, are talking a lot about housing and homelessness in the state. Pretty much a no-brainer, given that it is consistently what voters say they care most about.
Yeah, okay. Let's drill down into the Senate, the upper chamber. There are 30 seats in the state Senate. About half of them, are up for grabs. But really, only 3 of those races are in districts divided enough that money and campaigning could make a real difference. Democrats currently have a 17-13 majority. They need one more seat to get that 3/5 supermajority. And they're really focusing on 3 races to make that happen. Let's just hit each one quickly here. Quickly, Dirk.
We'll see.
All right, give us a rundown first on Senate District 5, the Central Coast.
Yeah, this is a district currently held by Senator Dick Anderson. He's a Republican. He's a former Lincoln City mayor. And he's actually a bit of a rare bird, as you know, Lauren. He's one of just 3 Senate Republicans who didn't participate in the weeks-long walkout at the Capitol last year. As a result, Anderson is one of just 3 Senate Republicans who can run for re-election at all. Anderson, I think, is seen as a pretty reasonable lawmaker, even by Democrats. He's shown he can work across the aisle on things like housing policy, which he's worked a lot on. And this year, he's facing a challenge from Jo Boudreaux. She's a Florence city councilor. She owns an art gallery. Like every district that's contested this year, SD5 has a Democratic advantage in terms of voter registration. It just barely voted Joe Biden for president in 2020. I think Democrats, though, concede that beating Anderson is going to be a big lift.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Senate District 25, that covers Gresham, Fairview, and Troutdale. And really, on paper, this race looks like it should be a really easy win for the Democrat, who is an incumbent. But that is not the case.
It is not. This is, in my mind, really the Senate race to watch this year, because you are right. This is a district where Democrats look like they should cruise. They've got a registration advantage of more than 11 percentage points. President Biden won this district by 15 points in 2020. But what you hear when you talk to political consultants about this area of the state, this district, is none of that means a lot in East Multnomah County. This is an area where races for the legislature and governor are often very, very close. Republicans believe it's the perfect place to test out this theory that voters are really tired of ineffectual Democratic policies. They think East County residents are tired of Portland problems, really, and they're leery about Portland problems creeping further and further east. So, this race is between Senator Chris Gorsuch. As you said, he's a Democrat. He's a former Portland police officer. He's now a college instructor. And he's facing Raymond Love, an insurance agent and colonel in the Army Reserves. Republicans say they have polling that shows Love has really closed the gap in the race. He could be statistically tied, depending on the poll you look at. And they've just been dumping a ton into his candidacy. That PAC run by Greg Walden put $430,000 into Love's candidacy, which as of earlier this week was enough to put him in the money lead. And then Democrats poured their own money in. They put like $500,000 in this week. So Gorsuch is up above 1.1 million. I mean, this is the highest spending race in the state right now. It's just going to be super interesting to see what goes on election night.
Okay. Finally, District 27, which covers Bend in Central Oregon. It's interesting when you think about this race, because Bend is seemingly so liberal now, but Republicans have held this seat forever. And man, Democrats keep wanting to flip it. They feel like this really might be their chance.
And I think like a lot of people looking at this in both parties believe that that's going to happen this year, frankly. I mean, this is a district, it's been held for a long time by Senator Tim Knopp, very well-known quantity in Bend. But nope, Knopp is one of those that can't run again because of last year's walkout. And not just that, though. Legislative redistricting in 2021 made this far more favorable to Democrats. They have an almost 10% registration advantage here. So the race is between Democrat Anthony Broadman. He's an attorney. He's a Bend city councilor, and Republican Michael Summers, who's a businessman. He's a member of the Redmond School Board. You know, as I say, there seems to be a very good chance that Broadman will prevail on November 5 and Democrats will flip the seat. And if that happens, as we've been talking about, Lauren, it could be enough to give Democrats that Senate supermajority.
Do you have any sense of whether Senator Tim Knopp, who, like we have said, held that seat for a long time, had a lot of name recognition, maybe he could have held on to that seat if he hadn't led and participated in the walkout? Any sense of whether he regrets that move at all?
I mean, everything we've heard from Knopp, right, is that he doesn't regret the walkout. He has always said he and his members knew the risks when they decided to do this, that there was that ballot measure that might rule them ineligible to run for re-election. They accept those consequences. And as I said, you know, given the changes to the district in 2021 redistricting, this would have already been a heavy lift, I think, for Knopp to win re-election. Actually, some people I've spoken with think that that contributed to his willingness to walk out last year in the first place. He knew probably he couldn't win re-election. He wanted to make Democrats pay for what he thought was overreach. I don't know. I have not heard that from Senator Knopp himself, but this is what some people have said.
Okay, so we hit the Senate, which is much easier to break down into digestible pieces, I think, than the House, which is just a bigger, more muddled map. But in the House, we have 60 seats. All of them are up for election this year. The Democrats have a majority of seats. Just give us some insight into what races you're watching in the House and if you think there might be any surprises.
Yeah, you're going to need to bear with me on this one, Lauren, because I've got a bit to say. So Democrats have a 35-25 majority today. And as we've talked about, they would need just 36 to achieve that 3/5 supermajority. And you're right, the map is more complex. And that's partly because of the dynamic I mentioned before, where Republicans have been holding on to a lot of money. Walden's PAC has a lot of money and deploying it late. So it hasn't always been clear where the big fights are going to be. But also the basic dynamic amounts to this. Democrats won a bunch of swingier House districts in 2022 that were actually pretty hard fought. You know, that was a year where Republicans thought they'd have a red wave. But Dems won a lot of districts, and now they have to defend those contested districts this year. So it's a party that is more on defense, I would say, than on offense. One key race is in Bend, where Democrat Emerson Levy, the incumbent, is facing a strong challenge from Kerry Lopez, the Republican. That's a race getting a lot of money, more than $1 million between the candidates. And there are some really intriguing races in the Salem area, too. Democrats are making a big play to flip a seat held by Republican Representative Tracy Kramer. That's a district the party thinks is probably its best chance to take an additional seat. It's the state's only majority-minority district. It's got a huge number of non-affiliated voters that make it sort of hard to predict. And Republicans are pouring a ton of money into defending Kramer, their member, this year. Democrats are also looking to push out Republican Representative Kevin Mannix, well-known, longtime Politico that got back into the legislature in 2023. He's in Salem. That could be an interesting race. But I have to say, once again, like the Senate, Portland's eastern, southeast suburbs are a big question mark here. Like with that Senate race, Republicans have poured a ton of races into 2 House districts in East County. Democrat Zach Hudson is in a big race to defend himself against a Republican challenger, Terry Tipsard. Ricky Ruiz in Gresham is in a big race to defend himself against a challenger as well. So, those are two places where I think Democrats are really sending up some red flags, want to make sure that they're defending their incumbent. And then the last one I'll mention is Happy Valley. That's where Janelle Bynum has held the seat for a long time, often had some pretty close races, and now she's left to run for Congress. So we have a competitive race between the Democrat, who's April Dobson, a Republican named Amy Reiner. I know it's a lot, but I just want to give people a sense of where the real interesting places are. And the upshot is we just don't know. Unlike the Senate, I wouldn't say there's any one of these seats that seems like it's necessarily a likely flip for the party that's being aggressive there. I think we could wake up the night after, the morning after election night, and find that actually the makeup of the House is exactly the same. Nothing has changed. We're 35-25, but we have no idea.
All right, and we've really been talking here about possible swing districts in the legislature, not the races that seem like foregone conclusions, but those races have some kind of interesting dynamics at play as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of races were decided in the primary, right? Just given how tilted many legislative districts are for one party or another. And I think there were some really interesting, not so new actually, faces headed to the legislature based on those results. Part of that is because of what we've been talking about. There's a bunch of Senate Republicans who can't run again. In their places, we are seeing a lot of folks emerge as new senators who are well known around the Capitol. So Mike McLean, right, a former a House Republican leader from Central Oregon, will be in the Senate. So will Bruce Starr. He was a very long time Republican lawmaker in both the House and Senate. And then there's a couple close family members who are sort of replacing lawmakers who can't run again. All indications are that Diane Linthicum, the wife of Senator Dennis Linthicum, will be taking a place in the Senate. Noah Robinson, the son of current Senator Art Robinson, will be taking his seat. And then lastly, let's note that Alex Skarlatos looks guaranteed to win a seat in the House. You will know, Lauren, Skarlatos is the soldier who helped heroically stop a terrorist attack in 2015 on a train in Europe. He's run for Congress a couple times. He's run for the Douglas County Commission. All of that was unsuccessful, but now he's won the primary for the House. He looks like he's headed to the Capitol.
Okay. Dirk, we made it to the last question, and I saved the easiest one for last.
Oh, good.
I'm guessing a lot of our listeners understand that it is actually local politics that can have the biggest impact on people's lives. But the stakes for who controls the state legislature have really increased in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, the conventional wisdom, and I don't think that it's wrong, is that with Congress virtually unable to get things done, they're not passing many bills through both chambers, the real policy work in the country is happening in the states these days. So in that regard, I think you're right, Lauren. Who holds power in Salem is as important as ever, given some of that inaction in Washington. And whether Democrats have a full stranglehold like they're looking for over the process, or Republicans can win back some influence and some leverage, I think is just going to be extremely important to the kind of legislation we see coming out of the Capitol next year, and the kind of fights and the kind of maneuvers and just the kind of political messiness that we see too.
Thank you for sharing your insight.
I loved chatting with you.
This episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded in the Gert Boyle studio here at OPB. It was produced by Andrew Thien, with audio engineering from Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. While you're there, you can become a member. You can also rate and review us in your podcast app of choice or listen along on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.